Well, I have several things to say. First of all, every time that Professor Mazars comes with new ideas, I'm kind of nervous because who knows, you know, there must be some new revelation that is going to wreck my theory. Again and again, I find myself relaxed and happy at the end of his lecture because I see no new evidence. Let me just, I don't want to waste too much time, just really very short notes. You know radiocarbon. No radiocarbon person would tell you or would put his money on any two single readings from any site, which means what we are doing, indeed, the two readings from Megiddo are from the 10th century or beginning of 9th. But there is no argument between us that this kind of pottery continues indeed. I put the transition to this layer, to this level in 920 BC, so it very well can happen in the late 10th century. Piasecki and me, the professor of physics from Tel Aviv, gathered many readings from all sites that were published, and when you put, you know, God in radiocarbon is in the accumulation of the statistics. And you have to accumulate a lot of readings in order to really get a reliable date. And as far as I understand, the reliable dates for this level are in the 9th century. Shishak, Jerusalem, it's kind of funny, you know, we are speaking about the great Shishak going to conquer Jerusalem and Judah is a great empire of King Solomon and so on. However, Shishak does not mention Jerusalem. In fact, Shishak does not mention a single city in Judah, be it in the Shephelah or in the highlands. Judah and Jerusalem is completely out of the Shishak list. So what can we do with this? The only way to explain it is that Shishak directed his campaign against another entity. I don't want to get into this, maybe later in the last lecture. And finally, Jerusalem, one note about Jerusalem. As far as I understand, Amichai Mazar has just provided me, at least, with the final proof that the building recently excavated there is 9th century in date, because it has a Cypro-Phoenician, or you know, the beautiful pottery that he showed from the building or from a field related to the building. As far as I understand, this pottery cannot date to before 920 as the earliest, and possibly later than that in the 9th century. And if it's in a field, the building must post-date the time of the field. So there's no question in my mind that the building on top and the structure on the slope, the one which Mazar showed and rightly is described as a beautiful building, they date both of them to the 9th century, and they are absolutely important because they give us the missing link in Jerusalem, in the development of Jerusalem from a small village of the 10th century and before to the big city of the 8th century. The 9th century is the missing link, and now we have it thanks to the excavation in Jerusalem.
And now, the beauty and weakness of archaeology is that is what Professor Mazar said before, is the interpretation of the same facts. I mean, they are not arguing about what was found, they are arguing what does it mean. The second difficulty with archaeology is that it's a very temporary science. A month before the mention of Beit David in Tel Dan, of the house of David, people could say with 100% certainty that David is never mentioned in any extra biblical source. A month later, they couldn't say it anymore. And this happens all the time, even now, even in this discussion that we heard, because what we'll hear in a month or in a year or in 2 years about new findings may change the whole theory, even of Professor Finkelstein. One thing is clear. When we look at archaeology, as I mentioned before, we have to look at the main source, at the main document of archaeology, at the biggest document of archaeology, at the Bible. And we cannot ignore the things that were written there, especially when we can find some correspondence between what is written there and what is written and what we found in the field in archaeology. As you know, the Bible considers Jerusalem a very ancient city, like maybe 1,800 years before BC. It considers it a very important city because it was the city of the priest to the highest divinity of the Canaanites. And there is little doubt in my mind that they are not inventing this thing, because Abraham, who was supposed to be the founder of monotheism, goes to visit the priest of the highest divinity of the Canaanites and sacrifices at his altar, which means, and of course the editors of the Bible didn't like this fact, but they did write it because this was one of the memories or sources or traditions. And because of their policy to include traditions even if when they are opposed to them, it makes us to be believing them more than other sources. An important thing in history is that we cannot rely on logic, and we cannot rely on probability. Even in the history that all of us were evident in the 20th century, we know how many unexpected things happened against logic and against probability. Of course, if Professor Finkelstein is right, and in spite of all the monuments in Jerusalem, and because of it being from the 9th century and not the 10th century, it was a little village. A little village. What does it mean, a little village, in a country like Israel in those days? It reminds me of the Mongolian archaeologist that went to the native village of Genghis Khan. And what did he see? A little village. Horse traders. And then he came to the conclusion that it's impossible that Genghis Khan made the biggest empire in the history of the world, from China to Poland. This is the reason why we cannot rely on it. We cannot rely on a Platonic logic. We have to go in an Aristotelian way to look at facts. And among the facts, not the main, not the only, but among the facts is the Bible. David is a historical figure, like Moses is a historical figure. And the distinction was made already by Hadam. There is a historical truth and there is an archaeological truth. Moses, if he existed or didn't exist, if he was called Moses or if he was the brother of Moses, Moses became a historical figure, even if we'll never find any archaeological birth certificate to show that he really existed. The same thing about David. But the difference is that David is not glorified in the Bible. Of course, if you say the Bible glorifies David because they wanted him to be this great king, on the contrary, Professor Finkelstein said this morning, who was David? A bandit who lived on what is called protection. He took money from peasants and slept with their wives. He joined the enemies of Israel. He joined the Philistines when they were going on war against Saul and Jonathan, whom he afterwards said that he loved him more than he loved women. He was a terrible man. He slept with a woman that he liked because he saw her from the roof while she was washing, or maybe she was washing because so that he can see her. But immediately afterwards, he called her husband to make it seem that the husband slept with the wife so that she is really pregnant from the husband and not from him. And when the husband was clever enough and said, no, I will not go there, I will sleep here in the palace, he killed him in the most terrible way. He sent him with a letter to his commanders in the field, in the battlefield, and said, put him forward and you go backward so that they will kill him. And they killed him. And the prophet Nathan didn't say he's a great king. He said he's a terrible man. He is like this rich man who takes away the sheep from the poor man. There is no glorification of David. And because there is no glorification of David, there is just the possibility that a man who was a bandit for so many years, who had a private little army, in such a chaotic country like Canaan in this time, in the 10th century, did make a little empire. After all, what's the big empire from Beersheba to Dan? I mean, what is it? It's 3 days horse riding. This is the great glory, and for how many years? Only 2 generations. In the days of Solomon, it was already finished. Rehavam lost the empire. Therefore, I believe that you cannot debunk the debunked. The Bible already debunked David enough. You cannot come and say now, he's much worse than the Bible says he is.
Can I make just a couple of brief comments, just because, and I don't want to devalue the Bible here, but I think that we're very fortunate, for this time period in this area to have a text to actually look at. But I think there's a huge value to trying to set the Bible aside, as you're doing your interpretations, to try and understand what the stones are saying and what the pottery is saying, or what kinds of things that you're finding, because we don't have texts like this for other areas of the world, for other parts of history, but we managed somehow to understand something about the people who lived there. So I think it's very useful to try and step back from the Bible, not to leave it alone altogether, but certainly to try and understand material culture without that as a backdrop, because I think then that automatically, no matter what, causes biases. So just thought that was.
Yeah, I want to reiterate the memory thing. Both of you have said, used the concept of memory, collective memories, for remembered memories. I'd like you to both to defend that usage, keeping in mind the vast unreliability of human memory and the fact that we can manipulate it and be manipulated by it.
It's 3:30, so we're going to have to. Well, I'd like to throw it out as a question to be responded to.
I just did.
Later on.
Twice. This is the second time.
I'll answer it later.
All right. Can we have the answer? Because we're off schedule, and we need to go on. So we'll answer the question, okay?
I'll remember to ask it again.
Yes, but will you ask it in the same way? That's the question.
We have another hot conversation coming up in the fourth story, because one of the questions that we need to ask is, up until now, we haven't encountered what we call traditional or official Judaism, have we? So what is the origin of that, and how is it connected to this story? So now we have to turn to the fourth story, which is the story